All right, so just to recap, in the last episode, we learned about how we can link up our design with our code file using these IB outlets and IB actions. Now, this gives us exposure to these design elements in our code file. And in this episode, we're finally going to start coding and start using some of these exposures. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to create what's called a variable. It's basically just a container that holds data. And we're going to do that just under the class declaration right here. And I'm going to write var, which is the keyword to create a variable. First variable is called random dice index 1, and it is of type int or integer, and I'm going to set the value of this container to equal 0 for now. So if you head over to the course resource list, you'll find a Swift cheat sheet that we've created for you guys that allows you to get an overview of how various coding elements are constructed. So firstly, we're going to zoom in on the variable section. And I'm going to draw your attention to this line, which is where we create a variable. So in order to create a variable, you use the keyword var, you give your variable a name, and then comes a semicolon, and you declare the type of data that your variable is going to hold. Remember that a variable is just a container for data. And then you finally give your variable a piece of data, say a number or some text. And later on, if you decide to change your variable or change the contents, you can just simply use the name of the variable and set it to something new. So let's take a look over here at the different data types, or some of the common data types. So int stands for integer, which is whole numbers. Then comes floats and doubles. Now both floats and doubles can hold numbers with decimal places. A double simply holds a number with more decimal places. So depending on how accurate you need your data to be, say if you wanted the number of pi to 20 digits after the decimal point, then you might choose to use a double, especially for scientific calculations. But if you just needed to do some basic decimal point mathematics, for example, to input somebody's height in meters or somebody's weight precise to 2 decimal places, then a float is probably a better bet. So then we've got the bool, which stands for booleans, which can only hold the values true or false. Then finally we've got strings, which are essentially strings of characters. So most of the time that's your text. Although of course you can store a number as a string, you just won't be able to do any mathematical calculations with it. So let's go back to our Xcode project for Dicey. Now it's your turn to make the next variable. So go ahead, pause the video and make random dice index 2. It's also a variable. It has data type int, and it is also going to be set to 0. All right, so how did that go? If it went well, then it should look something like this. Random dice index 2 is the name. We gave it the var keyword, and then we're going to use a semicolon and give it a type. It's also going to be an integer, and we're going to set the value of this variable to 0 as well. Now you can see it's pretty much identical to the variable that we created just above it, but it's got a slightly different name. It's the second random dice index. Great, so why do we need these containers called random dice indices? Well, we're going to generate some random numbers between 1 and 6 essentially. So if you think about our dice faces, there's only 6 possible images that we've got. Dice 1 to dice 6. And in order for our dice app to work, we need these images to be displayed up on here randomly. So we're going to create a random number generator, and then we're going to use that number to pick out a random image so that the user can see their dice on the screen. So the next step is to create this random number, right? So previously we said that you can create a variable and then you can set it at a later stage. That's exactly what we're going to do here. So inside the curly braces for roll button pressed, remember when you press the roll button, everything between this closing brace and this opening brace is where your code will get executed. And that's exactly where we want to create our random number. So let's go ahead and delete this comment. And inside here, we're going to tap into that container, random dice index 1, and we're going to set it to a new random integer. So we'll tap into the integer data type, and we're going to write dot random, and we're going to select the first one and hit enter. And once we've inserted that bit of code, we've got this little blue part that shows up, and this is just a placeholder. You can simply click on it to turn it blue and then hit the backspace to delete it. Now we're creating a new random integer, and we have to specify the range of our random integers that we want to make. So in our case, we want random numbers to be generated between 0 and 5. So what you'll write is the lower bound, so the starting point of all of your random numbers, then 3 full stops or 3 dots, and then the upper bound of all of your random numbers. So what this line of code will do is that it will create new whole numbers that are random between 0 and 5. So that means that the data that gets stored inside random dice index 1 could be 0 one time, it could be 3 the next time, it could be 2 the next time, etc. So this is how easy it is to generate random numbers using the new Swift 4.2 syntax. So this, of course, relies on the fact that you have Xcode 10 installed and you are running iOS 12. Now, if you're using an older version of Swift in an older Xcode, say Xcode 9 or 8, then you'll have to use a slightly different method, because this is something that we got only very recently in Swift, and it makes it a lot easier to create random numbers. In the next lesson, I'm going to show you how you can do the same thing, but in older versions of Xcode. So now that I've created a random whole number between 0 and 5, so that's from 0 up to and including 5, then it's your turn to try this out for random dice index 2. And in this case, we want exactly the same thing. We want it to hold a random number between 0 and 5. So pause the video now and see if you can complete this challenge. All right, so it's easy enough. All we have to do is tap into this second variable called random dice index 2, and we're going to reset its contents from 0, which it originally had, to a new value. And that new value is going to be a random whole number created using this int.random syntax. And it's again going to be from 0 all the way up to and including 5. So we can have any random numbers basically between 0 and 5. Okay, cool. So just to recap, we created 2 variables that's going to hold the random numbers, and then we generated 2 separate random numbers between 0 and 5. So the important thing when coding is that you should really check to make sure that your assumptions are reflected in the results. So let's go ahead and test out our code. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use a print statement to print out the result of random dice index 1. And we're going to run the app and see what happens. So either Command R or just press the play button. So this bit of code should only get triggered if the roll button is pressed, and only these 3 lines should get triggered when that happens. Okay, great. So we've got this showing on the screen. Nothing's happened so far, and we're just going to go ahead and press roll button to trigger these 3 lines of code. Okay, so looks like it's working, right? It's generating random numbers between 0 and 5. So everything seems to work well, and I can stop my app from running and I can close the debug area. If you assume that as you're writing code, you're constantly introducing errors into it, now for some people this might not be true, you might be really, really diligent, but for most of us this happens a lot. People create bugs, and the bugs get bigger the longer that you don't test your code. If you test it on a regular basis and test all your assumptions as you write them, then you're less likely to make mistakes. So in this lesson, we've created 2 brand new variables, gave it an initial value of 0, and then later on, once the roll button is pressed, we change that value to a random number as tested generates a random number between 0 and 5. And in the next episode, we're going to talk in depth about variables, constants, and data types in Swift. So I look forward to seeing you there, and that's all from me.